Ardrina უნდა გავაკეთოთ აი ეს სხვა.
იგი გავაკეთოთ პასუხი.
აი და უნდა მომწეროს და
Isso é região primacional. ერთი წამი. ერთი, ორი, სამი. 1 3 4 5 6 7 8 ის ხო
Hello everyone, thank you for being here on behalf of Metaform team and our workshop on critical analysis of Georgian architecture, which is held in frames of second edition of the Tbilisi Architecture Biennial. This year, Biennial is conceived under the name What Do We Have in Common? And it's a great honor to be part of this big family this year for us. Also, we want to express our gratitude to Henrik Biel Foundation of South Caucasus Tbilisi office and to all the sponsors and staff that made this possible. This international workshop, Metaform, hosts several prominent and international architects to reflect the concept of formal reading in the discourse of architectural theory. Today, our very special guest is David Bostanashvili. David Bostanashvili is the professor of architecture at Georgian Technical University since 2007, where he teaches architectural design and the semiology of architecture. He leads a studio workshop founded in 1990 by Professor Shota Bostanashvili, the Poetics of Architecture, which is focused on conceptual reflection on the links between architecture, culture, philosophy, and the art. The studio also allows students to explore the limits of the paper architecture. David Bostanashvili is the co-author of a monograph, Butsam, architect Victor Jorbenadze, and the upcoming book, Poetics of Architecture. David Bostanashvili has participated in numerous architectural workshops and competitions, and was the co-author of exhibition Narrativi at Art Gallery Nectar Tbilisi. So without any further introduction, we will be pleased to give the word to David Bostanashvili.
Thank you, Nodar, for your introduction and for this opportunity, for this workshop, to have organized a theme that is very close to me. I could say that the topic of formal analysis, what we're doing here at the workshop, is basically my specialty, I could say. So this is why the lecture I chose today is specifically addressed to the participants of the workshop. It might be too specific for the larger auditorium, for a larger public. I hope they also, the people who listen to our broadcast and who are not participating in the workshop, this workshop can update their views, some views on architecture, on formalist approaches to architecture, which suffers, which has a really bad name for larger audiences, the attitude of formalism and formalist analysis. But I will try to demonstrate that the formal analysis is ultimately a way to find meaning and to a quest for meaning. Our lecture is titled Self-Referential Science in Architecture, and we'll read architectural objects and see how they, above all, start referencing themselves and not how this architecture loses its symbolic power and its representative power. So, okay. This whole idea about formal analysis, that is the topic of our discussion. Of course, one can say that this theme has been integral part of architecture since Vitruvius, because even Vitruvius shows us his formal analytical methods regarding proportions and other tools he uses, and then throughout centuries Western tradition has developed strict canons, formal canons and methods of analysis and synthesis of form. But I would still like to say that it is only in the 20th century that the formal analysis takes a totally new turn, and it is from the 20th century, with the emergence of the subjects such as semiotics related to structuralism, that we have really updated view on the role of form and formal analysis for not only for architecture but for narratives, fairy tales, and all literature, cinema, and other forms of culture. So in the 20th century, we can say that the main project of the whole 20th century, early 20th century, was this quest of meaning, to understand how meaning happens, how meaning comes about, and not to give interpretations of the world, but rather discover the mechanisms by which humans articulate or assign meanings to the world. And this was the main project at the beginning of the century. And so we'll travel back in time a bit, like for about 50 years back in time, when this theory was quite dominant in humanities. And today I have a kind of pessimistic view that these structuralist and formalist approaches are taken a backseat for architecture and other arts, but I was very happy to see that today our workshop is dedicated to these themes, and so it allows me to basically tell first my story and to share with the students how I approach the formal analysis. And then we'll read Eisenman's text and see how Eisenman approaches and why Eisenman considers such conceptual analysis an integral part of the profession. So without any other further introduction, I will just share you with my own personal troubles, experiences, and adventures in trying to understand how an architectural object becomes a sign and how it tries to communicate meanings and in all its other aspects. So basically, when we talk about this idea that architectural object functions as a meaning, and above all it is placed in the field of meaning, then we need a theory of meaning, and in the theory of meaning we have a typical subdivision of the theory where we have a semantic aspect of meaningful forms or signs. Then we have syntactic aspect and pragmatic aspect, and I think it's pretty clear that semantics is mostly preoccupied with how with the meaning part of the forms, and syntactic aspect is mostly preoccupied between the relationship of those signs and their rules, and pragmatic approach is interested more to the context of usage of the signs and of these forms, social usage and other usages. So we won't talk about pragmatics today, we'll talk about semantics and syntactics. And for my personal analysis, the first object I would like to present you, I chose an easy way, and this was, I chose a religious building for analysis. And such a religious building, or rather a sacred building, usually there's no doubt that the sacred buildings are built purposefully to communicate meaning. So if you want to analyze sacred architecture, then the semantic analysis becomes quite easy, because that's the reason why a building was built, to communicate meaning. And syntactic analysis takes a backseat, it becomes less important. I wrote here the word hard, it's not hard, but it's less important. But unlike, for example, with profane architecture, then the semantic analysis becomes almost impossible. Like, for example, we are in this building here. Now try to find any meanings or any even being metaphors or other types of meaning in such a profane architecture is almost impossible and even futile. But then we have the idea to analyze such buildings in their syntactic aspects. So without But anyway, in my pursuit of these semiotic pursuits, I discovered that, yes, semantic aspect of architecture is something that always happens. People always assign meanings to the building, so when they don't understand why the building has this shape, people accuse the building that it signifies this, signifies that, finding them metaphors. And so what I thought that the semantic dimension of architecture is partly belongs to the public, and the public gives to architectural objects some meanings that are foreign to architecture. Like, for example, if they call, we know the nicknames of the certain buildings, how public perceives those buildings, and so all the nicknames and all the meanings that public tries to assign to the buildings don't belong to the architecture itself, and so we need to bracket this semantic dimension, and in order to discover what architecture is all about, I suggested that maybe it is less about semantic dimension of architecture than because it would then allow us to unleash this syntactic dimension, and this was actually the project that also Peter Eisenman was undertaking almost 50 years ago when he was exploring the syntactic aspect of architectural form. Of course, he also writes about semantic aspects. His writing is more complex, more nuanced, but here we'll just say that we bracket this semantic aspect and we talk about yeah. Okay, so, but for our analysis, I think we need to set some terms, and I will use the example of how I analyze this building here to tell you about some of the terminology that will be useful for our lecture. So this is Victor Jorbenadz's and Shota Qavlashvili's entry for Holy Trinity Cathedral in 1990. And so about some years ago, I had to analyze this building, do a semiotic analysis of this building. Okay, let's just look at some of the sketches, and this is the thought process of the architect. We see how he works, and we see that on this huge sheet, we see his sketches, he thinks, and these writings you see here, these texts don't necessarily relate to the building. In these writings, for example, he talks about the traditions of Caucasus and on some things he generally thinks about. So this is not just him explaining what the building is about, but rather his whole thought process and his spontaneous thoughts about the object. So this was just a very interesting artifact from Jorbenadz's archive. And so so here we have the model, so that we have some slightest some understanding and some idea what their proposal was for the Holy Trinity Church. Usually when I start my lectures in semiotics, this is a very convenient example to tell students that the purpose of architecture is to present meaning. And for example, let's read Nodarm Galoblishvili's letter to the Patriarchy, to the organizers of the competition. He supports the project. And let's highlight the main words they use. Okay, let me go closer. So I won't read the full quotations, but what they say is that this building is about to become a symbol of revival and to ascertain ideas of unity and to make evident that the present Georgian church plays such and so on a role, and then that it symbolizes architectural form take from historical memory. They remind us of glorious past, and then this church will express the hope of unification, and it somehow is associated, and the form therefore of the building is associated or evocative of the polyphony of Georgian songs and hilly landscapes. And so let's read the words that to become a symbol, to ascertain the idea, to make something evident, to remind us of something, and to be evocative of something, and to express something. These are all the functions of a sign. This is what signs do. This is what texts do. And this is how I introduce semiotics to the students, saying that, well, you see, not only texts or films or sculpture communicates ideas, but we see here a very strong belief that architecture is here to, as Aldo Van Eyck would say, build meaning, that it what we do is we build meanings and not just physical structure. And so my first question when I started trying to analyze this building was, what should I analyze? Analyze the building itself or analyze the notations that the building has left? Because the building is a complex phenomenon, and it might not be a good best idea to approach the building as a whole, because the building is not just a shell, it's plus the people, plus the impressions, plus the experience, and so on and so forth, plus lighting, materials. And so it's a complex reality. So in order to understand reality, we need to reduce this one kind of reality into the simple kind of reality. This was the main thesis of structuralism, that we take reality and we reduce this to an understandable form. We produce the model of the reality, and by analyzing the model, we understand the model at first, and then we can understand the reality. So this is why I thought, well, let's look at the model of the building. Now, in this case, we have the graphical model or textual model. So there are the elevations. We had sections, and the plans. Okay, and so where do we start? This is always a question in this business, that we do a formal analysis. Some of the lines you can see that you see those proportional lines and those circles and diagonal lines, and you might think that, oh, there you go, the architect suggests go this way. This is what I used to do this building. I used these circles and diagonal lines and proportions, but I decided to be a bit smarter, I should say, and so I decided to start classical semiotic analysis. And so I mentioned semantics, and let's get over with semantics first before we go to the syntactic aspects. So for the semantic aspect, so the semantics is occupied, what does this building mean, and how does this building communicate its meaning? And in order to discover the meaning of this object, it's very easy. We can either look at the object itself or read the explanatory note of the architects. So the architects make first architectural references. So they say that their form was inspired by centuries old traditions of Georgian church architecture. And as you are well aware, Victor Jorbenadze was a very ardent explorer and researcher of Georgian traditional architecture. So it was being a central cupola edifices. This translation maybe is not quite technically correct. So the apses of churches, and he also references Narigala fortress wall and the balconies of Tbilisi. So these are the architectural references that we have. We'll talk about the architectural references as how they contribute to the meaning. But when we say meaning, usually what we mean, when we say meaning, what is a meaning? A meaning, usually we see that a meaning is a form which something present brings something that is absent. So for example, if I look at the cloud and I say that tomorrow it's going to rain, cloud is here, I can see the cloud, but the rain is something that is not here. So I usually assign joins together to various spheres, like a trace and the animal. So the trace and the animal belong to different categories, so like sounds and meaning. So this is the basic idea of semantics, that you join something which is, and let's see what he joins. Okay, so what they wanted to represent into this building was that the cathedral comprises or includes is like a montage or a compilation of major there's a dominant element, this big church, this big dome here, and then we have smaller domes here, and they are united by a wall. So basically this is a direct allegory that we see so these small churches, domes, are literal domes, but also metaphorical domes. They are not just, they also represent various regions of Georgia that stand united. So let's remember that it is in the 1990s where the main problem and the main problem of the society was how would Georgia emerge as an integral nation after dissolution of Soviet Union or not. And so Jorbenadze addresses this question and proposes a kind of a amulet, that is supposed to ascertain an idea, and so we have, and this wall, and the wall is a literal wall of this building, but also a metaphorical wall, which is supposed to unite different parts of Georgia under one dome. And so we have fortified walls, the symbol, another symbol is the domes, and the last one is a strange one, it is a crown, which, so if the first two symbols are like icons of architecture, so in this case we can say that they are more like icons that have their metaphorical meanings, like domes and this wall. But the crown is not part of architectural vocabulary. A crown is something brought from from outside architecture. So what I was saying is that, well, the idea of unity belongs not to the idea of architecture, because this is what I was talking about when I said that usually when we think about meaning, a meaning is a form where something external is brought from the outside. Okay. And so the architectural figure always alludes to or aims at representation of some other object, whether architectural, anthropomorphic, natural, or technological. So this is the idea of representation architecture. So the architecture always tries to be reference or represent, be it a technological or aesthetic ideal or some natural ideal. And in this case we can ask the question, then what is architecture itself? So this is the main concern that we have here. So I won't go into detail why representation as a simulation. This is another article by Peter Eisenman where he discusses how representation becomes a simulation from the Renaissance onward. And so the main idea of this quote is that ultimately, as the stimulation of representation in architecture, architectural elements become representational figures carrying an inordinate burden of meaning. And so this is what we see. We have a building that carries a burden of meaning, but not necessarily an architectural idea. We can argue already that it is not architectural idea in itself. It is there to carry a meaning that is prepared outside of this architectural sphere. Like the idea of unity, of national integrity, and so on and so forth are the ideas that lie outside architecture. And so we have this burden of meaning. And usually, and when we look at the paintings, for example, we always look at the painting and what does it represent. And if we look at a painting that does not represent anything, then we are confused and we say that this is meaningless. But the point of our lecture is to say that actually there are other modes of creating meaning, and let's look at the other modes of meaning creation, which is not related to referencing. And here well, it's not totally correct, but I'm doing an equality sign between the idea of representation, of external reference, and of symbolic thought. So these are more like synonymous. So people who like to think symbolically, they always look for references when they have a sign in front of them, or a sign could be a picture or a sculpture or a film. So this is what Roland Barthes would call a symbolic consciousness, because for a symbolic consciousness, a sign is, well, usually it's a very usual dynamics, that what matters is the contents, but the form that the content is expressed by is random, and it changes throughout history. And the symbol always seems to stand by itself in the world, and this is one. And beyond the symbol, we see the whole forest of meaning, as Barthes writes, and this is why. So we see that the form is simply an outside, and what matters is the inside. This famous allegory that there's outside and inside, and so so we have this. The outside is simply an expression of the inside, and the inside is this complex forest of meanings. And the outside simply points to that inside. And this is the whole, the idea of a symbolic imagination or symbolic consciousness. And so this symbolic consciousness dominates culture throughout centuries, and we see that in the 20th century we see other modes of consciousnesses, how we want to imagine meaning. So let's, and this is what we will call paradigmatic and syntagmatic relations. So Okay, let's just read Barth. So every sign includes or implies three relations. To start, there's an external relation, which unites the signifier to a signified. This is what we're talking about. So a signifier is this church, and the signified is the idea of unity, of wall as a protection, and so on and so forth. Okay, but then if you look at the signs more carefully, there are two exterior relations that the signs have. This is a virtual one that unites signs to a specific reservoir of other signs. And there's another one which relates signs to their neighboring signs. We'll explain this in the next slide. So for a short introduction, for the school that we are now looking at, approaching, is structuralism. It only says that the signs gain their meaning when they belong to an ordered system of already existing signs. For example, a word is not a symbol but a sign because it belongs to the already formed system of whole signs. So every word is related to every other word in the language. So we have a system and not just a symbol. And this is the difference between symbolic consciousness and this semiotic consciousness. For a symbolic consciousness, you can understand the symbol by itself. It's isolated. It's not related to anything else. You don't need to compare the symbol to other symbols and so on. Okay, so the basic terminology would be our syntax and paradigms. Okay, so a syntagm is a chain of signs like this sentence. Okay, so we take inspiration from linguistic analysis to analyze architectural structures. Okay, I think it's a very simple idea. A syntagm is not a synonym of the phrase. It's simply a chain of different signs that stand together, and by standing together, they create meaning. Okay, symbols usually don't need to stand together to create additional meaning. Usually, symbols don't have syntax. One symbol plus another symbol doesn't mean a new meaning. But when we take one sign plus another sign, then we have not just one word plus another word, but the whole new meaning. Okay, and then we have the second relationship. So this is the first relationship that the sign has, the relationships to the present signs, co-present signs in the same structure or syntagm. But the signs also have this virtual relationship with the signs that are absent. Or for example, let's take the word chain. We can compare the word chain to all the signs in the language that resemble it, but they are also different from it, like sequence, group. This is what we could call conceptual associations, what Saussure called, but there's also phonetic associations. Like we can say instead of chain, we can compare chain to change, rain, gain, or we can compare signs to size, sees, or sentence to sense, tense, sentence, or essence. Now this might sound a bit weird, but in French and in other languages, actually this phonetic associations is quite important. In Georgian, this example is almost impossible to make because Georgian words never sound similar. They are very distinct from each other. Okay, so generally a paradigm is a class of objects that have something in common, but are also different from each other. So the easiest example is how our sentences are formed. We have syntagmatic axis where we combine words, and we have paradigmatic axis where we choose the word. So in this case, we have nouns. All the nouns belong to one paradigm, the verbs to another paradigm, and so we have this. So this is the very basic idea how meaning actually functions. So we have all three relationships here. Of course, the man signifies something. It can refer to an actual man that exists there or here or there, but also the man is related. This sign man is related to the co-present members of the syntagm, and also it is related to the absent members of to the members that are absent from this sentence. So these are our. And for an analytical purpose, what we do, for a paradigmatic analysis, we compare and classify. So what is the basic operation of analysis? We simply need to compare man and boy. So for example, in a political discourse, we can take sentences of the politician and compare why he chose this word and not the other. And this operation of comparison is important not only in discourse analysis, but in other forms of analysis. And for the syntagmatic analysis, what we need is what we call articulation, and which might sound a bit weird. Articulation just means cutting up the phrase to identify the parts of the expression. Now you might wonder, okay, here it's very easy to identify the parts of the expression because it's a language that we all know, but what if we have a language that we don't know? And so this is when we are confronted with a language which we don't know how it is, how it articulates its meanings, then the first step forwards to the analysis is cutting the syntagm. So what Barth says that every time we face a semiotic form that we need to analyze, we always face a text sans fin, which means an endless text where we don't know where are the borders between meaningful units. Okay, so and the first task is to identify where can we cut this syntagm and to have the parts, and then to compare these parts together and see that some parts resemble each other, some parts don't, and then we have all these classes or the paradigms. And so we discover how this language functions. And the whole idea of structuralist activity is to discover not what sentences mean, but how the language functions, which then generates sentences. So the analysis is focused not on particular analysis of particular objects, but the analysis of the system that produces these things. Okay. So in architecture, we are less interested in building itself, rather we're interested in the system that produced this building. Okay. Oh, this font is a bit small for me. Okay. No, this is a short definition of a paradigm, that it is a group or a reservoir of members that have something in common, and we create meaning just by. Let's go. Okay, so. Now let's go back to our object that we want to analyze. Again, what do we analyze? And so we have two questions: which syntax to use for analysis, and then how to cut it. So I chose the plan for my analysis. These slides are, I think, a bit okay. That's yeah. That would be an example of trying to find articulations in the syntagm or in the given system. This is the first step of analysis. Okay, so the first thing I did was just a very, not a non-semiotic analysis. It's just looking at the plan and trying to interpret it. And this is just a very traditional way of interpreting a plan, and there's no surprises here. It's a church, and therefore we can read the shape of the cross there. But then I saw, and this would be a preferred reading of this interpretation of this object. But there's another interpretation, like then here it resembles more like a flower. But now this is a step towards the right direction, because it's not really a flower. What I was trying to do here was discover the underlying structure for this building. And so what if we say that this whole building is based on this kind of structure, which I would like to call a code. Now in my lectures I always oppose the usage of the word code, but I have seen many great semioticians use the word code in very blurred context, so I said, okay, I will use the word code. So we can somehow say that this drawing on the right is like a code of this building. And now I have this and so I achieved what I wanted to achieve. I cut the syntagm, and now I know that I have the syntagm is made up of circles. And the paradigm here is that the circles are of different sizes. So we simply have one member of the paradigm. So it's a very weird system where I simply have, it's like a sentence with one noun, only with just nouns, for example, and not verbs. Like if there was a square here, then we would have a noun and the verb. But we have just circles. So the paradigmatic axis is composed of the circles of different sizes. So so what is the goal of this? Ultimately, what is the goal and what is the point of all of this? And here I would like to ask Roland Barthes to help me and to say that this steps towards structural analysis is not analysis at all, or it's more like an activity. And this activity is neither strictly reflective nor strictly creative or poetic. It's just an activity. So it blurs the borders between analysis and synthesis, or reflection and poiesis. Because structural thought and structural activity, or a structural man, that as Roland Barthes defined him, surpasses those borders, and it is to reconstruct the object in such a way as to manifest thereby the rules of functioning of this object. So next sentence. So the structural man, which in this case I become the structural man who analyzes this object, takes the real, decomposes it, then recomposes it. So that was the whole idea of the structuralist school. And between these two stages, where we decompose the object and then reconstruct it, there occurs something new. And what is new is nothing less than the generally intelligible. So the simulacrum, this is a simulacrum, this is not the real object anymore on the right. I produced a simulacrum of Butza's idea or Butza's temple. But the simulacrum is intellect added to the object. So you pursue intelligibility and not symbolic interpretation or metaphoric. The one way is you go and try to metaphorically read the building. But here the theme is the challenge is more complex. So the idea of intelligibility surpasses the allegories, metaphors, and the traditional tools we try to read poetry, literature. Restructuring the way the poem functions, for example, is adding intelligibility to the poem. Whereas just saying that the poet felt sad or bad and he expressed his sadness with this metaphor is simply producing another interpretation of the poem and not adding any further intelligibility to the poem. So the structuralists analyzed how the systems work. And therefore, for structuralist analysis, we don't copy. So this is not a copy anymore of this one. So the left one is not a copy of the right one. In fact, it is a veritable fabrication of a world which resembles the primary one, not in order to copy it, but to render it intelligible. And this is how we can describe the 20th century. So the 20th century is this passing from symbolist thought to paradigmatic and syntagmatic thought. And therefore, when Richard decomposes a poem by Mallarmé, or where, for example, Mondrian does his painting, or Boutor, or the authors he mentions, what they are doing is a structuralist activity. And what they are doing is doing this same operation, for example, and therefore the paintings by Mondrian and Kandinsky and Malevich are not abstractions, but they are more like compositions, tools to understand, to render the world intelligible. And we'll return to this point. So the whole idea was to find the certain mobile fragments of this. So to sum up, what was the point of this the operation? That we have dissection and articulation. I already talked about it. To dissect or to discover where can we cut the object is to find the certain mobile fragments which whose differential situation engenders a certain meaning. The fragment has no meaning in itself, but it is nonetheless such that the slightest variation wrought in its configuration produces a change in the whole. And this is the first step towards this so-called self-referentiality, because as we can see that these circles now don't have any. We are used to thinking that circles symbolize something, but no. In this case, the circles are just have not a positive meaning of a symbol of like endlessness or something, but they have what we call an oppositional meaning. The meaning of the circle in the center is just that it is in opposition to the circle that is on the right, or that the circle is in this circle's meaning that it is smaller than the previous one. It is very similar to how music organizes the sounds. None of the sounds in in the spectrum that we have in Western music, C, D, E, are not symbols, like we can say that the C symbolizes something or the D is a symbol of something. They function together and they have oppositional meaning depending on the key or on the, not the key, but the mode that you chosen. So the meaning of a C in C major has some different function, and for example in D major it has different function. So the meaning is not symbolic, but purely functional, and this is what basically Barth is also writing here. Okay. Okay. So what I did, okay, so I inspired by this idea that basically structuralist activity involves making these compositions or simulacra of the world. I said, okay, I looked at this is my code, and so from this code I can generate other sentences. So from this code I can generate Buca's temple, but what if I start to generate other things? So I took an easy step and I didn't do a volumetric or even plans. I just said, okay, I used Jorbenadz's work to decompose it and to restructure it in order to fabricate new compositions. Okay, these are my, and so these are no more interpretations, but true fabrications, so structuralist of this temple. So we see that analysis was never the point. So in the classical sense, it never was an analysis. Like to remember this famous meme, like it never was. Okay. So, and this is how we can understand the paintings of the early 20th century. They are not abstract paintings, but they are those non-referential paintings that function in structuralist logic. And so this is what we can start talking about, this non-symbolic and non-referential architecture. And this is important, I think, for us, because the basis of our Georgian School of Architecture is exactly this. We do compositions, what we call in the first year, and I think that we need to better understand the point of the composition. The point of the composition is not aesthetic, to understand the aesthetic principles of form, but to understand the grammatical components of the form. And to understand that every composition is simply a variation, and to be able to generate these variations is more important. So I think even though structuralism is not a dominant or even on the periphery of humanities today, and it has been since the 60s, I think it's still an important school because it's still a basis of Georgian School of Architecture. And we need to better understand where it comes from. Where these ideas of Prones, of Lisitsky, or architectons of Malevich, or Rodchenkos, or other ideas come from. Okay. So, and because these compositions don't have neither symbolic meaning and nor emotional meaning theoretically. Well, Kandinsky's thought was a bit different actually. He did assign spiritual meaning to his compositions. But if we reread even Kandinsky through Barth, then we discover that it is more like a structuralist activity rather than a spiritual activity. So, so then architecture is not anymore an aesthetic phenomenon. So this is where this idea of formality comes in forward. Let's see. Okay, I think we have 2 hours, but I'll try to finish our lecture in about half an hour. Okay, so this is why I won't read the. Okay, so for paradigmatic thought. So as we said, if we abandon the symbolic thought, then we have a paradigmatic thought or syntagmatic thought. What Barth means here is that every school which questions meaning sees the sign either in symbolic aspect or in paradigmatic aspect or in syntagmatic aspect. Of course, they function together when I speak, for example, right now. But for a researcher, usually they have their own specific attitudes. And for example, a formal attitude would be this paradigmatic attitude where I want to compare the signs, the two signs to each other. Okay, I will try to. So for a person who tries to do to conduct this kind of paradigmatic analysis, for him the ultimate act of meaning is the act of choice and realizing there are alternative choices. So just by understanding that there's a whole field of elements from which you made a choice, This choice is what generates meaning. Unless, again, in contrast to symbolic consciousness. In symbolic consciousness, you exchange form and idea. Form and ideas are two different categories. But in paradigmatic school, as Barth says, paradigmatic consciousness, the act of signification is the act of choice. And in syntagmatic consciousness, let's read it. In syntagmatic consciousness, it most readily renounces the signified. It is more a structural consciousness than the semantic one, which is why it comes close to practice. It is the syntagmatic consciousness which best permits. Okay. And the next quote is much put better. Imagination. He uses the word imagination. How we imagine the sign to be, what we imagine the sign to be. So the syntagmatic imagination no longer sees the sign in its perspective. It foresees its extension, its antecedent and consequent links, the bridges. The sign extends to other signs, and we have the meaning. Then is this? We have the image of a chain. Hence, the dynamic of the image here is that of an arrangement of mobile. Substitutive parts whose combination produces meaning. And this is the key sentence of our lecture. So this one, that to discover the arrangement of mobile substitutive parts whose combination, or combinations rather, produce meaning, or more generally a new object. This is what I did with Butza's work. I produced a new object by discovering these mobile parts that I could exchange. I could have done there are other things, like I could have substituted the circles with squares, or just done other operations, but for our lecture it's not, it could have been a better illustration probably what I mean by the syntagmatic activities and form or paradigmatic activities. Okay. Now let's go to our word reference. So I use the word referent or reference. So when Barth writes that, that in such an analysis, what I've shown you, the signified or the meaning part of the sign becomes, okay, we most readily renounce the signified. So this renunciation of the signified is very similar to what we can call a self-referential sign. Now, there are two schools of semiotics. For one, there's a signs, and which has this reference, like a word and the objects, for example. And the other school, which has that a sign is a unified unity, which has two sides, a signifier and a signified. So these two schools don't really go together as well, but still we can link the idea that we can have just signifiers without signifieds, where each signifier simply links us to another signifier, not necessarily to a signified meaning. And we can say in another language, we can say that we simply have this self-referentiality, that the referent is absent from the sign, signs without reference. So this is why I use the word self-referentiality. And so we see that this self-referentiality arises when we simply step into the paradigmatic and syntagmatic analysis. These references don't matter anymore. And again, does this produce meaninglessness? And Barth again, to quote, no, because the structural man takes the real, decomposes it and recomposes it, and this appears to be little enough. So it's a very simple and little... and you can accuse such an activity like meaningless or uninteresting or useless. Yet, from another point of view, this little enough is decisive. For between the two objects, the two tenses, there occurs something new, and we already touched this quote. So no, this is not actually on the contrary. So when Mondrian or Malevich do their drawings, their paintings, what they do, they discover meaning. They try to see they are on the way of intelligibility. Okay? And for this meaning, you don't need to represent a giraffe or a horse anymore in the painting. And so ultimately, this structuralism is a battle against the chance. And this is how we try to impose a form on something that was basically formless before. And ultimately, the structuralist man work of art is what man rests from chance, and it is another the conclusion of this of the first part of our lecture. Okay, let's. Okay, I think. I think I already told what is written here with my own words, that ultimately in the 20th century, all these authors, the people who wrote non-narrative literature, non-narrative films, or non-figurative paintings, and dodecaphonic music, they all did the same thing. They tried to restructure the system and to find an intelligibility in these activities, which is the profoundly structuralist activity. Okay, so let's quit. Now let's again, what do we mean by reference in architecture? Okay. So usually we already have this. I already talked about this external meaning in an object, in an architectural object, and this is it can be a static, functional, or structural. And the production of this external meaning has always been considered the first step in any building, that is its program. So how do we start doing buildings? We think about the function, about like what the building requires, and so on and so forth. And even before we start drawing, we construct in our minds the huge machine of external meanings. And then the architectural form is simply a representation of this machinery. This is, and we can use the word reference here that in this sense. So this is one idea of referencing, that architecture references either a function or some ideal, some aesthetic ideal, or even it references some psychological state of mind, states, and so on and so forth. Of course, there's other kind of references in architecture. These are the referentiality. So what Jorbenadze does, again, in his building, he references the typology of Georgian churches with many apses arranged in circles. So in this sense, then, we have an interesting thing here. In this sense, architecture is self-referential. The whole field of architecture is simply every building that references every previous building. Okay? So then the whole profession as a whole is a self-referential activity. So we can already use this word self-referentiality in this context, but this is not actually what I was still talking. This is one example of self-referentiality. And this is also a very important, interesting example, because what Jorbenadze does, he talks to two different addressees. So when he talks about that his church unites all the churches of Georgia under one crown, he talks to the larger public. But when he presents his project as a reference to typology, he talks to the professional architects. Okay, so and this is what Charles Jenks famously meant by his double coding. So the architectural object is double coded. It addresses the public at large using metaphors and allegories, but also it addresses the professional community by providing them these coded messages. Okay, so this is one example of self-referentiality. Okay, the part two. Part two is a bit even more, might be a bit more confusing. Okay. And now so what my idea was here to link Eisenman's thought with Roland Barthes' thought, and so to know what I was trying to do here. So to start with Eisenman, his main concern back in the 60s and 70s, he had two main problems. The first one was the problem of modernity, because as Eisenman correctly pointed out, there was a fundamental problem with modernity with architectural modernism. It never, in a sense, modernism happened in culture because modernism reflects a profound change in culture. So we see this self-referential paintings, music, film. But these changes never happened to architecture because, as he says, because of architecture's dogged because architecture obeys the categories of form and function. And architecture always had this fail-safe, form and function. And because architecture has those two categories, it never understood the fundamental changes that happened in culture. It was the overcoming these dialectics of form and function that happened in arts, as we saw. Because form and function is this, form and function belong to this symbolic consciousness. Right? And so if you continue simply to say the modernist buildings are functional, then we simply continue the old tradition that comes. So therefore, for Eisenman, modernism never happened in architecture. And the true modernistic attitudes will be possible if we think what is true self-referential signs in architecture. So to quote, to have a very simple example, we might say this: at a perceptual level, these two objects are similar, Mondrian and Schroeder's house, but for Eisenman, there are two different concepts. So the one is a true modernity, where we have this break, where the man is no longer a center or a central agent of his actions, and so on and so forth. Well, he explains lengthily why these changes happen in modernism. Whereas Schroeder House is simply a continuation of Renaissance tradition, and it's more like late humanism, because it's adherence to function, to the traditional ideas of function and technology and so on. And so, as he writes, because modernism clothes this idealist ambition in the radically stripped forms of technological production, it has seemed to represent a break with pre-industrial past. But in fact, functionalism is really no more than a late phase of humanism, rather than an alternative to it. And in this sense, it cannot continue to be taken as a direct manifestation of that which has been called the modern sensibility. So this is how Eisenman sums up the modern project, that it never was truly modern. And then he references, for example, Le Corbusier when he uses references to ships, airships, cars, and so on and so forth. And so this is how Eisenman begins his journey towards this idea of syntactic architecture, where he abandons this semantic dimension of architecture. One of the most, so this is Gandelsonas's words, one of the original aspects of Eisenman's work is discovery of the possibility of modifications within architecture which are the result of shift in the dominant characteristic of architecture from semantic to syntactic. And by parallelizing, or what I said, bracketing the semantic dimension, the syntactic dimension is seen in a new light. So I want to relate this idea of syntactic dimension in Eisenman's architecture to Barthes' interpretation of structuralism. In this way, both the syntactic and semantic dimensions are uncovered and seen in a new light. Okay, so the theory, so this is what I was trying to do, to link these two authors, Eisenman and Barthes, which Eisenman doesn't really reference Barthes' writings in his essays. He kind of avoided the European structuralist thought, and he even criticized it. But so this is just my suggestion that we can rewrite Eisenman's texts using Roland Barthes' language, and it would render it much clearer, at least for me, because what I was talking before is very clear, but for my listeners it usually is very obscure. And this is a paradox, because I think that Barthes' writing, this semiotic writing, is the clearest writing you can have, the most transparent one, whereas sometimes the audiences get confused a bit. And so the idea was this controversial idea that maybe so when Eisenman talks about modernist sensitivity, it is basically the same what Barthes talks about when he talks about structuralist activity. And so if we compare these two texts, now this text is a bit, Eisenman's theory is much more nuanced and complicated. I'm oversimplifying things a bit here. So as Eisenman writes, the one tendency for the modern architecture would be to to be a recognizable transformation from some pre-existent geometric or Platonic solid. In this case, form is usually understood through a series of registrations designed to recall a more simple geometric condition. So this is one operation. Then we can think about the form as a series of transformations. This is one idea. But for Eisenman, this is not enough to define a modern state, modern tendency. It's still, for Eisenman, such an operation. When we see architectural form linked to its previous and next conditions. Okay? I'll show the illustration and I'll show what I mean. Is not enough. For Eisenman, it's added to this tendency. He sees architectural form as an atemporal, decompositional mode, as something simplified from some pre-existing and set of non-specific special entities. Here, form is understood as a series of fragments, signs without meaning, dependent upon, or without reference to a more basic condition. And then if you compare this writing to Roland Barthes, what he talks about, that in syntagmatic imagination, we foresee the sign in its extension, its antecedent and consequent links, the bridges. Okay? Or other quote, this functional imagination nourishes lastly all those works, okay, all those works whose fabrication by arrangement of discontinuous and mobile elements constitutes the spectacle itself. And these are the examples of such spectacles in art. I think this is a very good summary of what structuralism was about. Okay, again, so if we imagine, so if you talk about this self-referential art or architecture, then all those works whose fabrication by arrangement of discontinuous and mobile elements constitutes the spectacle itself. So this operation, constant operation of shifts, substitutions, replacements and other kinds of shifts is the work itself. And to exemplify, we can look at Eisenman's work. Now, so we can, so this is not your typical sketch where we have different stages and where the process leads to an ultimate form. Now, if we look at these writings, what if we interpret this work in a different fashion? So this is what Eisenman was talking about, that we have this condition. This condition simply references its previous condition and its subsequent next condition. Okay, this is the first idea. But when we are presented with these conditions at the same time, then we can see that all these conditions presented at the same time, they become a kind of a syntagm. Now the words before and after, they are not temporal anymore. It is not a before and after in time. It is before and after in two dimensions in this case. So we can read, so the project here of this Guardiola house, is this what we are presented with? Not the building that is to be built, but from my interpretation, the true Guardiola house is simply this syntagm where we see all the states at the same time. And so this would be a radical conceptualization of architecture, where architectural object itself loses all meaning, and we can understand it only through the text, notational system that is given here. Okay. And so, like for example, somebody did the rendering of this building, which was not built. It is this famous Guardiola house, as I remember it. And this was the most useless endeavor ever in the history of architecture. Had this house been built, from my point of view, it would ruin everything. So this notation is its house itself. But actually, this is my interpretation, because Eisenman doesn't really agree here with me, wouldn't agree here with me, because the second problem for Eisenman was this, that the physical building itself must include this conceptual aspect. So what I said here, that we don't even need the physical building to have a conceptual architecture. The conceptual architecture is this, this text, graphical text. Okay? But Eisenman's concern was this, exactly this, that, and this is why conceptual art becomes a very important topic for him, because in conceptual art we see that the conceptual artist, the created object, loses all the significance. So what matters is the concept that produces the work of art rather than the work of art itself. But Eisenman here argues that in architecture this cannot happen. Because of a desire to do away with sensual aspect and the traditional relationship of form and content, conceptual art has overlooked the potential of the universal aspect of physical form to be used for conceptual ends. So in his very complex essays, Notes for Conceptual Architecture, Eisenman tries to find the ways to show us that realized physical form can be used for conceptual ends. And therefore, and he clearly states that there's a clear difference between art and architecture, that architecture always, that we cannot really say that architecture is just a generative matrix like this. Okay? This was just my pure interpretation, that to consider architecture as just a pure generative matrix. But Eisenman, he doesn't wouldn't really agree with me here. He's much more nuanced and much more sophisticated, delicate in his analysis. So what do we mean by conceptual aspect? It's a very complicated topic. What do we mean by conceptual? I'll just show you a very simple example how we distinguish conceptual from from sensual. We can understand better the conceptual if we oppose it to the sensual. So for example, these written words here, they have conceptual quality rather than perceptual. Like, look at this little painting here of two lines crossing each other. Now this is a object which, well, it's not beautiful or not beautiful, but it has a strong perceptual qualities, which is the idea of centrality, crossing. So the object on the left is a perceptual phenomenon. But if we say take the same object, the same kind of structure, and insert it into, for example, a word, then it becomes an X. So it loses. So in this case, this cross loses its perceptual importance, significance, and becomes purely conceptual. This is the very simplest explanation of the difference between conceptual and aesthetic. Okay? And so what Eisenman asks, suppose, so it doesn't really matter whether this X is written red or with what font do we use. We already recognize X because it belongs to the already formed system of signs. So the perceptual aspects of the letter X don't matter anymore because it belongs to the conceptual order. And for conceptual order, the realization of the concept doesn't really matter. So if we go to the art gallery and we see like this kind of thing, well, first of all, we are puzzled. We don't know what we are looking at. Now we'll see what we are looking at. But so basically, what would be the difference if the artist did, instead of white boxes, he used the metal tubes or even black wire? So for conceptual art, nothing would change. If we look at the object as a perceptual phenomenon, that we have totally three different objects with three different perceptual qualities. But this is not the point of this work. And so this is what Eisenman is not. This relationship with A, B, like we can say that here the relationships could be the thickness of the stem and the distance between the voids, right? So this matters little for conceptual art, but for architecture this cannot be the same. Now this is actually, this is just an example to show you that when we go into the gallery and suppose we see this, then suddenly we may discover actually the conceptual meaning behind this work, because we see that this cube is repeated in different states. And this cube then becomes not symbolic but self-referential. It simply references all its states that it can be. And this is this famous work by Sol Levitt, which is simply variations of incomplete open cubes. And so this is the conceptual diagram, and the realization is just an accident. It doesn't really matter for this art. The artwork is itself this. This itself is artwork. And this was the attitudes of the 60s, 70s conceptual artists, where they made art language group and Sol Levitt and other artists, where what matters is this conceptual matrix and not the... and so this is where Eisenman tries to argue and say that physical realization matters. These distances between the placement. So suppose if we placed those not like this but like this, would this change concept or not? So here not. But so what Eisenman wants to argue for is that this matters a lot, and this is the last part of our lecture. I hope you're not very tired. Anyway, we've been talking for an hour. We'll definitely finish in 10 minutes. So what I want for introduction, I always, it's a hard, it's a pretty tough essay from Eisenman when he tries to talk about conceptual architecture, because it's much more, as I said, nuanced, and he makes many complicated different distinctions between conceptual and semantic again, and so on. And he references Noam Chomsky's linguistic theory and so on, and this, we don't really have time for this. And I found another article by Eisenman where this point that the physicality or the material realization of the object matters a lot. So this is the realization of the basic idea of black frame, of this frame, what we call this bare frame. From a concept, from some point of view, we might say that they are the same. But now we'll see that the one produced by me, does not equal this one. Whereas this one produced by Le Corbusier is definitely a conceptual architecture, and we'll see why. Eisenman says that this is the first example of self-referential sign in architecture, this maison domino. So we cannot substitute this with this. They are not equal because all these aspects that the columns are inset and that the slab has this relationship to these columns are the part of this conceptual meaning. Okay? And so this is where Eisenman tries to go with this analysis. Okay, let's go quickly through his arguments, why he thinks so. So from my point of view, how I would approach this idea. So the first idea was to cut the syntagm, right? So we have a syntagm and we want to cut it into parts. Now we might consider that, yeah, it's easy to cut it into parts. There are slabs and columns, but we can also cut it like two tables and a slab with legs there, okay? It's never clear how you are supposed to cut the syntagm. Okay, and then we can cut further the syntagm into really these lines and horizontal slabs, and anyway, in the end, you will get these basic elements. That is plane, column, and this footing. So here, here starts the analysis of Eisenman, which let's read through it, or should I try to reinterpret it, which will be shorter. So the dimensions of any rectilinear plane, whether floor, wall, or column, can be designated simply by two notations. So a plane has simply two notational states. It's either AA or AB. Either two sides are equal or they are different. But however, so the state where the two sides are not equal is marked. It is different. And here we can have this first question. Is this intentional or not? And so this first clue towards self-referential signs in architecture is this idea that in this case where we have this distinction between side A and side B could be intentional. And this intentionality is already a step towards this conceptual architecture. Or then, but then the let's look at the other relationships. So for example, in this case, we have equal relationship between all the slabs. They are equally distant, right? But we could consider an alternative position of these slabs, or a state where they are configured in this state. So all of them would be equally valid. So okay, let's see. So what is Eisenman doing? He is trying to discover these variations of the basic shape. And doesn't this remind us of this paradigmatic activity where we try to discover the variations of a given element, like a circle and all the variations. Like in Piet Mondrian's painting, a square and all its variations in color and proportions. So all these are variations, anything more than geometry. so this is not enough to establish that domino is an architectural sign. It's just a geometry. For Eisenman, at this point, it's simply a geometric play. But if we go to and consider the relationships between columns and the slab, then the situation starts to change. And since the text, I don't know how visible it is and whether you are reading it or not. So we see that the placement of the columns in domino house, unlike in my pair frame, there's a distinction here. Here, the columns are set back on the longer side and almost on the edge, on the shorter side. And what we can see that there must be some kind of intentionality in it. And this intentionality, again, further underlines the difference between side A and side B. And now we can be sure that there is a certain intentionality in this object just by seeing that even the placement of the column underlines this difference between side A and side B, because we could have like different arrangements of this column then where this relationship, like for example in the 7th example, then the difference between A and B is not evident, but it is this position here that makes this distinction clear. Okay, so let's see. So this is marked. So we clearly see that this position of the columns in this way is clearly marked, and the idea of marking and the presence of the column. So the column is not simply present there, but it also marks its own presence. So the idea of marking and the presence of column as a mark, as opposed to a mere division of structural elements, is understood through general linguistic concept of redundancy. Thus, when the column location acts to reinforce the original geometric A-B relationship, which is itself is so clear as not to need reinforcement. So while A and let's go to a conclusion. Why A and B are literally present, there is also an intention to have A and B become something other than their actual presence. The redundancy of mark thereby signals that there is something present other than either the geometry or function of the column and slab. So we are already 1 hour into our lecture. So this last phrase is basically deserves a bit more attention. But since we are not on a seminar, I will just skip it. But basically, this is the argument that this doesn't derive from the logic of construction or from the logic of the function of this house. This reinforcements that this column is not just a physical presence there, but it also becomes a mark of its, and it marks its own presence in a particular way. And this particularity is what transforms this geometry into architecture. So there is an unintentional or literal reading of the column, and then there is the fact. But does the fact itself that so the slab plus the spatial marking, the location of the column, suggests an idea about the sides A and B, which is an idea about itself, a self-referential statement. This then may be primitive, though truly modernist phenomena, one that speaks about its mere existence and its own condition of being. So just by this small nuance, we see that the sign becomes self-referential. It doesn't reference function or structural soundness. It simply is self-referential. So the same so he continues and says the same happens when we look at the slabs in the horizontal datum here. So we see that let's omit it. Like for example, we can see clearly that if the columns are set back on longer sides, then we see that maybe this object is not supposed to continue in this direction and they can extend in other direction. Okay, so again, the form starts to mark its own intentions. And that's the and so this is how, and then again, if we start talking about the stairs, even the location of the stair, and this little nuance, I don't know if you have noticed this nuance in Domino House, but the relationship of the stair and the slab is very particular, very specific. And again, this is here not to, the location of the staircase produces two propositions which are in opposition, but together refer to only to the nature of the horizontal surface itself. So it doesn't refer to the soundness of construction or of function or of circulation. but it's simply self-referential, and it reinforces the idea of the slab, the relationship between slab and the stairs. And the same can be said about the footings, which can be placed anywhere. And so the idea that the footings are present, because Corbusier could have shown the footings on the ground as if they were not there. But then we wouldn't be able to distinguish the first slab from the other slabs. So again, this distinction between slab 1 and the rest of the slabs, this small footing marks this distinction between one slab and the other. And so here, and therefore, to distinguish architecture from building requires an intentional act, a sign which suggests that a wall is doing something more than literally sheltering, supporting, enclosing. It must embody a significance which projects and sustains the idea of wallness, beyond mere use, function, or extrinsic illusion. Thus it is paradoxical in nature. The sign must overcome use and this extrinsic significance to be admitted as architecture. But on the other hand, without use, function, and existence of extrinsic meaning, there would be no conditions which would require such an intentional act of overcoming. So Eisenman doesn't renounce function in architecture. He simply means, as he put it very eloquently here, in sum, a collection of planes and lines are projected in geometry, or as materialized in sculpture, can never be architecture precisely because they do not have inherent conditions of use and significance which must be overcome and subsumed. So this is the whole idea, that the function is there, but it is simply subsumed under the conceptual aspects. Therefore, and this is how he concludes that ultimately it is because of these markings which are self-referential. The domino house is the first, very simple, but the first self-referential sign in history of architecture, and thus the first, a true break with Western tradition, Western humanist tradition. And this is how we can read Eisenman's work. Like on perceptual level, if you compare these modernist buildings, we might think that they are similar. Then there's some aesthetic choice. Differences are simply in aesthetic choices. But now we see that, for example, Eisenman uses his columns and walls in for totally different ends, for conceptual ends. And so, therefore, there's a very strong difference between these three buildings here, which we won't go further. So so the idea of conceptual architecture really allows us to read better and understand better the buildings of Eisenman, and to truly distinguish the modern, because then this would be truly modernistic statement where Corbusier's Garches still could be a continuation of humanist tradition. Now I would like to conclude today's lecture with my own interpretation of what Eisenman did. Let's link with the terminology that I introduced at the beginning of the lecture. So as soon as Eisenman starts to analyze paradigmatic variations, he leaves the symbolic order and opens paradigmatic analysis where referentiality is already suspended. So the big question is any member of this paradigm marked? It is clear that there is no intrinsic quality of conceptualism or architecture in the placement alone. It doesn't mean that if we place columns like this, then we get a conceptual architecture. Okay, it's very clear that that's not the point. Like, it's not a recipe. It's okay if we place columns like this, then we get modernist architecture, and if not, then not. No, that's not, and it's very clear from Eisenman's own arguments. But I have another argument to say why this is not the case. I have a different interpretation. We can interpret this article differently. It is only when we start to relate different members of a paradigm that they start to reinforce themselves. It becomes more like a game where every member is dependent on the other. So in this systematic game, in such a view, there emerges self-referential architectural sign. So I still want to return to this conceptual, purely mental aspect of architecture and argue that when Eisenman started to compare different states of the column, it is by doing this act alone that we have this emergent quality of architecture. So just by realizing that we have this whole paradigmatic field and we can choose many positions, but we chose one. This is just enough to talk about architecture, And because the choices that we have not made are present yet. So the actual presence is there, the actual present choice, but the choices that we haven't made or the absent combinations are included into existing syntagm. And when we realize that every syntagm includes the elements which are absent, virtually present, this is where we can start talking about this structuralist activity or conceptual architecture. When we start to realize that there is a veritable modulation of coexistence of all signifiers, whether they are present or absent. So this would be my interpretation, and to say why this drawing is a meta-architectural object or an object about itself. Okay? So this was, so what I tried to do was to rewrite Eisenman's writing into structuralist terminology, and kind of produce a more simple version, or a much more simple interpretation of this argument, and say that basically what really matters ultimately is that can we construct the whole systems where every sign simply refers, where the signs refer to each other, where they are united under one paradigm, and where can we discover all sorts of action. And it is in this game where we discover action of architecture. So in this case, architecture becomes more like an activity rather than a finished product. And this is where I kind of don't quite repeat the same thing as Eisenman was trying to say. I would say that it is this architecture then becomes more like an activity rather than a finished product. And it becomes like a mode of thought rather than a finished artifact. And the artifact can have the marks of its own creation. And this was Eisenman's argument, that it simply has the marks of its own activity, and this is how they can become conceptual, how architecture can then become conceptual. Okay, so I'm sorry for such an obscure lecture, but then I wonder if there are any questions, if questions are even possible in this case.
Yes. Thank you, David, for this interesting chain of the thoughts in this lecture, and I would like to ask the attendants, online attendants or physical attendants, to have they might have questions for David. Do we have any online question?
No, not yet.
What about the comments from the audience?
I will ask one question about the first part of the lecture. First of all, thank you so much. This was really interesting. And I have a question about your code, about the organizer's work. So as I understand, it's not just like one. I mean, it depends always who's doing the analysis, and you can get individual code, right? So there is not correct or incorrect code.
Yeah,
right?
That's a good question, and that's probably I think what the point was that if you follow the logic of this semiotic system, then as if the semiotic system itself dictates the course of action, and the interpretations you produce don't really matter because you've simply followed. So the question would be: is there a true code under behind the structure that we are trying to analyze? And the answer could be that maybe not, because as Bart says, it's more about fabrication, which has intelligibility to the object, and intelligibility doesn't necessarily translate into true or false logic. So I think maybe Well, I actually never thought about it. Does about this individual's own personal meanings that he tries to find under the structures that he analyzes. In some sense, all these compositions then don't belong to an individual. Like anyone could have produced such compositions, and then they become purely conceptual matrices rather than expression of individual views. And so this might be actually one weak point from our perspective of structuralism. But isn't this what happened in the beginning of 20th century? If we have films without narrative, or if we have art without figures and representation, and that's the whole state. And so the quote is that the man is removed from the center of his world. This is the short summary of modernist sensibility. And I think, we are removed. Our personalities are removed from these interpretations, and therefore they are more like they exist simultaneously, as all the possibilities are maybe even equally valid. Later we could say. But of course, for structuralists, that was not really the case. I wouldn't. It wouldn't be correct to say that this is what structuralists thought. They actually thought that when they produced analysis of an object, they would reconstruct the true meaning of this object. And this is my playful interpretation of these themes, because at this point, I think Barthes was already on his way towards post-structuralism, which allows this idea of basically entropy. But the original structuralists, they wouldn't accept probably such a free interpretation of their own theory. They would require a much more strict analysis, where you truly discover the true nature of this object, and not just your own, one of the interpretations among many others. Their idea was definitely to discover the truth, the ultimate truth behind surface structures, all the structures that govern the human spirit, as Lévi-Strauss would say. So here, then we can say that this is why it's a bit confusing, because what Eisenman and Barthes call modernist attitudes or structuralist activity, it resembles a bit more a postmodern attitude, or even post-structuralist attitudes, because somehow you can mistake those conditions, modern and postmodern conditions. And it's interesting because Eisenman was writing in 70s about the modernism of the 20s. And maybe he was interpreting the 20th century modernism as a postmodern theorist at that time already. So these are the questions open for interpretation.
Thank you. Does anyone have a question online?
No.
Maybe no. Okay, in that case, I might have one question. If we consider from your interesting lecture this character of self-referential architecture, we can then maybe assume that architecture is able to be objective. So if you consider this paradigm of the thoughts and chain of the thoughts, we might say that architecture is able to be objective. So in that case, what is the role of interpretation done by architect? Is it in this case to realize this syntagm, as you called, of architectural discourse, or to abstract it, or to reinterpret it? This syntagm.
So it's basically, so I think what my personal interpretation of all these themes was really more geared towards the understanding the idea of architecture as more like a play, a self-referential play, where you participate in play as an individual, and what you enjoy is not purely aesthetic enjoyment, but rather the enjoyment you receive from understanding how the system works and how you can misuse the system. I think it's more about misusing the. Okay, so let's I think what my lecture was more influenced by post-structuralist contaminations, right? Because where I was going with this is that instead of using structural analysis to discover even intelligibility, we can use structural analysis to produce new conditions, as if we participate in a game. And this was not a structuralist position at all. They wouldn't call it a game. But from my own perspective, we can go towards the idea of an architecture as a system with its own rules, with its own internal self-referential rules, and we simply participate into these into this system, and where therefore and the whole problem of objectivity maybe even disappears in this case. We simply have all the playful interpretations and misunderstandings that that are generated by our readings. So yeah, I think these questions really you really got the point, I think, with this, with what I was doing here. So that I was actually misusing the structuralism, which was definitely, basically, really an objective, which was to become an objective science. And here we abandon this idea of objective science. But I took inspiration from Barth's certain quotes about his fabrication, about structuralism as an activity. Then if it is an activity and not just analysis or creation, then it is something other. It's neither analysis nor creation. It's a different kind of activity. And so this is my own interpretation of this activity. Yeah, so it's what matters here then is activity. And so if we say activity, then activity can be related to the idea of a game or a play. And this is my train of thoughts, I think. This is where I was going with it. That we can reinterpret the word activity as for play. And then if we start thinking about plays, then we discover that play is not a futility. It is not actually time not well spent, or or a game is not something that serves something, but rather, as Heising appointed a play in his theory of play, it's a very integral part of human culture and human endeavor. And so it is in playing that humans actually discover the meanings of the world and produce the cultural meanings. So I don't avoid the word play because I put into this word a much more broader connotations that play produces cultural meanings. It's not just something for kids. It's not for kids at all, actually. So this is why by the end of the lecture, we can really conclude with this word that we are basically playing, and through playing, we add intelligibility to our objects that we are now doing in this workshop.
So I guess this leaves a lot of chance for our workshop to be successful.
Yeah, I hoped that what I would show here would be kind of a bit of an inspiration for the students. So the workshop, that what they would consider is all the alternative states of the syntagm they're trying, instead of just analyzing proportions or looking into them some order that is there. What if they could consider the alternatives to the shapes or elements that are given there, and reconstruct the object. And so from my own perspective, I think that what they could do is, like, for example, take a Jorbenadzes building. Actually, one team went this way, I think, when they analyzed it and they produced a model. But this model is not Jorbenadzes' work anymore. And I will see this one printed out. And this is this fabrication. This is what I think more or less Barthes was talking about. They produce a new object. So the point is to produce a new object and not to discover the meaning of the actual object. And here, that's a good question, actually, because then it seems that Roland Barthes really misinterprets a bit structuralists somehow. He's kind of correct, but at the same time he's incorrect. Because when structuralists reconstruct the object in their models, this model is really related. So their idea was to be truthful and to to be objective, and that the model that they reconstruct corresponds to the reality. This was their basic belief. But now I think this belief, the belief that we can find the ultimate structure, was criticized in the 60s by all the philosophers. And this is how structuralism actually ended, because philosophers attacked structuralism on these very grounds, that you cannot presume that there actually is a structure. And this is why Umberto Eco titled his work Absent Structure. The structure is not a presence that is there in the work and that you have to discover it. And this is why I liked Barthes's work. He also goes into this direction. So in this case, Barthes's work is really a step towards better a critique of structuralism rather than understanding of it. So the structures are not really there. They are all, because what is the next step? When we discover the structure of a building, then we look at the structure of the society, then we look at the structure of the language. And then what we try to do is relate the structure of the build form to the structure of the kinship relations and to the blood relations or kinship relationships, and then relate this to the structure of language, how these kinship relationships are expressed through language. And then we get a superstructure, which explains how all the substructures work. And then we can continue this process on and on and on. Ultimately, we go to the ultimate structure, which would explain basically the human spirit as it is, or maybe even God. And so this was the idea that was under attack in the 60s. So your question actually was on point. It's not objectivity, but it's structure, whether structure is really there, or whether structure is a methodological invention. And Umberto Eco argues that no, structure is a methodological invention openly, and we cannot presume there to be actual structures that govern societies or works of art and so on and so forth.
So if we don't have any question online and here, I would like to thank to David for this interesting lecture. I would like to thank you to all of you, to online attendance. Thanks to Tbilisi Architecture Biennial and all of the students, first of all the tutors that participate in our workshop, lecturers, so on and so forth. And thank you to all of you, and we will meet you again to the next lecture. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Nadal.